The early months of 1942 were a time of deep uncertainty for the United States. The shock of Pearl Harbor had not yet faded, and across the Pacific, Japanese forces advanced with a speed that stunned even their own commanders. One stronghold after another collapsed. Hong Kong, Wake Island, Guam. The Philippines were fighting desperately to hold on. In the waters stretching from Southeast Asia to the Central Pacific, the Imperial Japanese Navy controlled the tempo of war. For the U.S. Navy, the aircraft carrier became the only instrument capable of striking back. Battleships lay crippled or sunk, and the carrier groups, Lexington, Yorktown, Enterprise, and Saratoga, carried both the burden of defense and the hope of response. But even these powerful vessels were vulnerable. Their survival depended on an unbroken ring of air cover, combat air patrols that could intercept Japanese aircraft long before they came within bombing distance. At the center of this fragile defense stood the F-4F Wildcat, a rugged, stubby-winged fighter that served as the Navy's frontline aircraft in the early war. It lacked the elegant maneuverability of the Japanese A6M-0, but it had thick armor, self-sealing fuel tanks, and could survive hits that would tear a Zero apart. In the hands of an exceptional pilot, the Wildcat could fight and win, but the margin was thin. One of the men who understood this balance intimately was Lieutenant Edward Butch O'Hare, only 27 years old, with a quiet demeanor that contrasted sharply with the ferocity of aerial combat. O'Hare was the son of a Chicago lawyer who had famously turned against organized crime. Determined to build his own legacy, O'Hare graduated from the Naval Academy, trained as a naval aviator, and earned a reputation for precision flying. His squadron, VF-3, had been transferred to the USS Lexington as tensions rose, and by February 1942 he was part of the thin line guarding the carrier during operations around Rabaul, one of Japan's most heavily defended strongholds. Japanese strategy during this period was clear: eliminate American carriers. Without them, the United States could not challenge Japanese landings or reinforce isolated territories. And so, across the vast Pacific, Japanese search planes combed the ocean for signs of American task forces. On February 20, 1942, they found one. A long-range Kawanishi flying boat spotted Task Force 11's position. The message was relayed to bombers stationed at Rabaul, and within hours, dozens of G4M Betty torpedo bombers and Mitsubishi A6M Zero fighters were airborne, heading toward Lexington's known location. The Japanese plan was straightforward: overwhelm the carrier's defenses with a coordinated multi-wave attack and sink her before she could retreat into open waters. Aboard Lexington, radar, still new, still prone to misinterpretation, picked up distant contacts. Orders went out to launch fighters, position anti-aircraft crews, and prepare for high-speed maneuvers. The air group commander scrambled aircraft as fast as fuel and deck handling allowed. Wildcats clawed their way into the sky, forming a protective ring ahead of the carrier. But air war is rarely ideal. Squadrons became separated. Pilots misread headings. Some intercepted the first wave. Others were too far afield to be useful. Amid the chaos, O'Hare and his wingman found themselves positioned well ahead of the ship, almost by chance. As they closed with the formation, a malfunction forced his wingman to retreat to Lexington, leaving O'Hare alone against 8 inbound Japanese bombers. This was the environment in which he operated: a Pacific stretched thin by war, a carrier group relying on every available fighter, and a pilot who understood that a single failure could invite catastrophic loss. The responsibility was immense, and the enemy approaching was experienced, coordinated, and confident in their ability to strike. The Japanese pilots flying that day were no amateurs. Many had combat experience in China and the Philippines. Their formation discipline was tight. Their approach was steady. The G4M Betty, though fragile due to its lack of armor and self-sealing tanks, carried heavy torpedoes capable of gutting a carrier in one blow. All they needed was to get through the last line of defense. And at that moment, the last line was Butch O'Hare alone in his Wildcat. Fuel diminishing, ammunition limited, altitude steady, closing the distance toward an enemy force that fully expected to fight through fighter resistance, but not from a single aircraft. As the bombers continued toward the Lexington, the broader context of the Pacific War pressed down on this single moment, shaping what would come next. The USS Lexington had sailed into danger knowingly. Task Force 11's mission in February 1942 was to probe Japanese positions near Rabaul, disrupt enemy operations, and test the limits of Japan's expanding perimeter. The Pacific was vast, and any ship operating near enemy-held territory risked discovery. Still, carrier commanders had little choice. The only way to relieve pressure on Allied forces was to threaten Japanese strongholds. Rabaul, with its network of airfields and deep natural harbor, stood as a fortress guarding Japan's southern advance. Before dawn broke on February 20th, Lexington launched a strike toward Rabaul. The planes never reached their target. Japanese search aircraft caught sight of the task force early, and the element of surprise evaporated. Vice Admiral Wilson Brown, commanding the force, made a swift decision: cancel the attack and prepare for incoming raids. He turned the carrier group away from Rabaul, but once Japanese eyes found a carrier, retreat was not enough to escape pursuit. Back aboard the Lexington, flight operations shifted into full defensive posture. Deck crews worked with muscle memory, refueling, rearming, repositioning aircraft. Anti-aircraft gunners checked ammunition belts. Damage control teams distributed equipment around the ship. The carrier moved into a zigzagging course, hoping to complicate the approach angles of incoming torpedo planes. Above all of it, radar operators monitored the advancing dots that crept closer across their screens. This defensive choreography was new for the U.S. Navy. Radar had only recently been integrated into carrier doctrine, and early sets required experienced operators who could distinguish real threats from atmospheric interference. Yet on this day, the system performed with clarity. The large inbound formation was spotted at long range, giving the carrier's air group valuable minutes to react. Fighter direction officers vectored Wildcats toward the incoming threat. But the beauty and frustration of aerial combat lies in its unpredictability. Some fighters reached their assigned intercept points only to find empty sky. Others engaged enemy aircraft too far from the carrier to prevent a coordinated assault. Miscommunication, visual misreads, and weather interference scattered the defending Wildcats. Lieutenant O'Hare's position was almost accidental. He and his wingman, Lieutenant, junior grade, Marion Duff Dufilo, had taken off as part of Lexington's combat air patrol. Their assigned sector placed them slightly ahead and above the carrier. When radar reports began calling out multiple inbound groups, they maneuvered to intercept. But as the first wave of Japanese aircraft descended on the task force, O'Hare and Dufilho were just out of position. Too far ahead to engage the initial contact, but too important to recall. Japanese tactics that day focused on sequential strikes. The first wave drew defending fighters away from the carrier, leaving gaps for bombers that followed. Their approach was methodical, shaped by years of refined doctrine. The G4M Betty was designed for long-range strikes with the expectation of limited opposition. Its crews relied on tight formations, overlapping fields of defensive fire, and speed. If they broke through American fighters, they could deliver their torpedoes with deadly precision. When Dufilho radioed that his guns had jammed, he had no choice but to break off and return to the carrier. For O'Hare, the moment created both danger and opportunity. As he circled alone, he spotted the second formation of Betty bombers heading directly for Lexington at low altitude. There were no other American fighters between them and the carrier. No additional squadrons were close enough to intercept. In that instant, the larger strategic picture telescoped into a single responsibility. If these bombers reached torpedo range, Lexington would be forced to maneuver sharply, losing the ability to recover aircraft or maintain defensive posture. A single torpedo hit could cripple her, leaving the task force exposed to follow-up strikes. O'Hare himself later recalled that the nearest Wildcats were too far to help. He was the only one in position to defend the carrier. The bomber formation held tight. Japanese pilots were trained to ignore lone fighters, relying on mutual protection and the firepower of multiple machine guns to deter attackers. But the design that made the Betty fast and long-ranged also made it vulnerable. Its fuel tanks lacked armor, its fuselage was fragile, and once ignited, its engines turned into fireballs. O'Hare checked his ammunition again. Only 450 rounds per gun. Enough for a minute of sustained fire, but in reality, only a handful of short bursts. He understood that every second mattered. He would need to fire at point-blank range, strike vital components, and break the formation's integrity without wasting ammunition. Below him, the Pacific stretched endlessly. Above him, scattered clouds drifted like thin veils. Ahead of him, 8 bombers advanced with unwavering purpose. And somewhere behind him, the carrier Lexington relied on the courage and precision of one pilot who had not expected to stand alone. The complexity of the Pacific War, technology, doctrine, geography, human skill, was converging on the moment he pushed his throttle forward and dove toward the formation. The human angle. A lone pilot. Against time. Inside the cockpit of the F-4F Wildcat, the war didn't feel like strategy, doctrine, or grand maneuvering. It felt like vibration through the seat, the constant hum of the engine, and the sudden tightening in the chest when a pilot realized he was alone. For Butch O'Hare, this moment was not heroic. It was raw survival mixed with a sense of duty that outweighed fear. He had trained for formation flying, coordinated interception, and disciplined tactics. What he now faced was none of those things. There was no wingman, no squadron leader's voice guiding him, no chance to regroup. The human mind reacts strangely under pressure. Some pilots froze, others fought panic. O'Hare's strength was his focus. The instant he spotted the Japanese bombers, a quiet calculation began. Range, speed, angle, ammunition. This clarity was not innate. It came from months of training woven with a temperament that stayed steady in moments that crushed others. He knew Lexington carried thousands of sailors below deck. He knew one mistake could doom all of them. That awareness transformed fear into purpose. At 15,000 feet, the sky felt impossibly wide, yet O'Hare's world narrowed to a single point ahead. Sweat gathered inside his gloves despite the cold. His breathing slowed. His mind shed everything unnecessary. This was combat in its purest form, not fury or chaos, but an intense and silent determination. What he carried into that dive was not confidence in outcome, but confidence in discipline. And whether the bombers saw him or not, he knew he had to commit. The world beyond his canopy ceased to exist. Only the target remained. This human clarity laid the foundation for every tactical choice he made next. The tactical angle. Turning ammunition into precision. Tactically, O'Hare faced one of the worst scenarios possible for a fighter pilot. a large, tightly packed bomber formation designed to create interlocking fields of defensive fire. The G4M Betty crews were trained to aim for any fighter climbing or diving toward their vulnerable fuel tanks. The smart choice for any pilot was to wait for reinforcements, regroup, and attack with overwhelming force. But time was gone. The bombers were minutes away from torpedo range. O'Hare understood the geometry instinctively. The formation held a box shape, 2 lines of 4 aircraft, each overlapping its neighbor's fields of fire. The only safe approach was not from the sides or rear, where gunners could shred a Wildcat, but from above and ahead. A head-on pass was the riskiest maneuver in aerial warfare. Closure speeds exceeded 500 mph. Margin of error was razor-thin, and the attacker had only a split second to fire. But the forward-facing nose guns on the Betty were far weaker than its side and tail gunners. He chose the hardest path because it was the only viable one. His Wildcat's 450 caliber Browning machine guns held a finite amount of ammunition. At standard rates of fire, he had barely 60 seconds of usable bursts. That meant no warning shots, no prolonged tracking, no unnecessary sprays. Every pass required precision, measured in fractions of a second. O'Hare planned to shatter the bomber formation by eliminating key aircraft and forcing the surviving bombers to scatter. His dive was steep but calculated to maintain speed without overshooting. He aimed at the lead plane's engine, knowing a single spark could ignite the unarmored fuel tanks. Every burst was controlled, never held longer than necessary. He fought not just the enemy, but aerodynamic limits, gravity pulling him forward, air resistance shaking the Wildcat, and the narrow firing window shrinking as he closed in. What made this engagement legendary was not just bravery, but the tactical discipline that allowed one fighter to challenge an entire formation. The Japanese perspective. Confidence turned to shock. From the Japanese bombers' viewpoint, the approach to Lexington seemed predictable. Their formation was intact, their altitude steady. Their escort fighters, busy elsewhere, had confidence that the Bettys could defend themselves with coordinated fire. Japanese doctrine emphasized aggressive forward momentum, complete the mission, deliver the torpedoes, and accept losses if necessary. Their aircraft lacked armor because it was sacrificed for range and payload. That trade-off had served them well in the Philippines, Malaya, and Dutch East Indies, where Allied air defenses were scattered and disorganized. The bomber crews believed they understood American fighters by this stage of the war. They expected clumsy attacks from behind, inexperienced pilots hesitant to approach the formation head-on. The sudden appearance of a lone Wildcat diving through a patch of cloud disrupted this assumption. At first, they believed it was a scouting pass or a lone survivor returning from another fight. But then, the Wildcat aligned perfectly with the lead bomber's flight path, something Japanese gunners rarely saw from American pilots. Their shock grew when O'Hare didn't break away after a single pass. He executed dive after dive with surgical precision, emerging each time from the cloud layer above them. The defensive gunners struggled to track him. His angles were unpredictable, his timing too rapid. Fires erupted in engines. Fuel tanks ignited. Formation spacing wavered. Japanese crews later expressed disbelief that a single fighter could inflict such disproportionate damage so quickly. What they witnessed that day was not luck or recklessness. It was mastery of a tactic they did not expect the Americans to use effectively so early in the war. Their surprise would only intensify as the engagement continued. The technological angle. Wildcat vs. Betty. Technologically, the duel unfolding in the sky on February 20th was a confrontation defined by design philosophy as much as by pilot skill. The Grumman F-4F Wildcat was the product of a defensive mindset. Armor plate behind the pilot, self-sealing fuel tanks, and a thick, rugged airframe that could absorb punishment. It was not fast by 1942 standards, nor was it agile enough to match Japan's famed A6M-0 in a turning fight, but it was built to survive. A Wildcat could return home peppered with bullet holes. A Zero or a Betty often could not. The Japanese G4M Betty stood at the opposite end of the engineering spectrum. Designed for extreme range, it sacrificed armor, self-sealing tanks, and structural reinforcement. This made it fast and capable of long-distance raids deep into Allied territory, but catastrophically vulnerable to .50 caliber fire. A short, well-placed burst could ignite its fuel and reduce the aircraft to a fireball within seconds. Japanese crews understood this weakness, but relied on formation discipline and overlapping machine gun coverage to deter enemy fighters. O'Hare's machine guns were formidable, but limited in ammunition. Each Browning M2 fired 800 rounds per minute, meaning he could empty his guns in under a minute of continuous fire. The guns were synced to converge at a specific distance ahead of the Wildcat, creating a deadly focus point if the pilot aimed correctly. That convergence zone became O'Hare's primary weapon. He positioned his aircraft so that each burst struck precisely at the engines or cockpit, where armor was non-existent. This technological clash, durability versus vulnerability, precision versus volume, defined the physics of the battle. O'Hare's Wildcat didn't need to overpower the formation. It only needed to exploit the weaknesses designed into the Betty itself. The leadership angle. Training that shaped the outcome. Leadership within the U.S. Navy's aviation program shaped the behavior of every fighter pilot who entered combat. The Naval Air Training Command stressed discipline, gunnery precision, and decision-making under pressure. Pilots were drilled to understand their aircraft's strengths and avoid engagements that favored the enemy. They practiced deflection shooting, firing where an enemy aircraft would be rather than where it was. They ran exercises simulating surprise attacks, low ammunition scenarios, and single-pilot interception missions. O'Hare had internalized these lessons. His squadron's commanding officer, John Thatch, later famous for the Thatch Weave, was a proponent of tactical innovation and constant training. Under Thatch's influence, VF-3 pilots practiced coordinated maneuvers, head-on attacks, and energy-based fighting. They were taught to adapt, to improvise, and to exploit the limitations of Japanese aircraft. This leadership culture meant that even when isolated, O'Hare carried the collective mindset of a well-trained squadron. He did not panic when left alone. He did not retreat to wait for support. He acted decisively because he had been trained to analyze situations quickly and with clarity. Japanese leadership philosophy differed sharply. Their pilots were highly experienced but operated within rigid tactical frameworks. Formation cohesion and mission completion were paramount, even if conditions deteriorated. The Betty crews expected disciplined American approach patterns and predictable maneuvers. O'Hare's willingness to break those expectations, attacking head-on, making vertical repositioning dives through clouds, and firing only at precise moments, was rooted in a doctrine that rewarded adaptability. Leadership shaped his instincts, and those instincts shaped the outcome. The moral and psychological angle, seeing death up close. Aerial combat magnifies every emotion a human can experience. The sky appears peaceful from a distance, but inside a combat zone, it becomes a place where life is measured in seconds. For the bomber crews, the sight of a fighter diving out of cloud cover was a sudden reminder of mortality. There was no place to hide. Their aircraft was fast, but not fast enough. Their armor was light, their fuel tanks volatile. Every burst of 50 caliber fire that struck a Betty meant unimaginable chaos inside. Flames erupting, instruments shattering, oxygen masks melting against skin, crews fighting for breath as their aircraft spiraled downward. For O'Hare, the psychological weight was different, but equally heavy. He could not dwell on what he was doing. To hesitate meant death for himself or the ship below. His focus had to remain absolute, stripping away any thought beyond angles, airspeed, and timing. Yet the human cost was real. Each bomber he set ablaze carried multiple crewmen, pilots, navigators, radio operators, gunners. Their destruction was necessary, but it was not abstract. Psychologists later noted that fighter pilots experienced a unique form of emotional compartmentalization. They saw enemy aircraft not as men, but as threats. Only after landing, when the roar of the engine faded, the adrenaline drained, did the human impact settle into memory. The Japanese crews, witnessing their formation fragment and burn, felt disbelief and dread. A lone fighter was not supposed to do this. Their mission discipline wavered as instinct fought doctrine. They were trained to expect casualties, but not catastrophe at the hands of one pilot. The psychological shock on both sides would reverberate long after the battle ended. The moment O'Hare committed to his dive, the nature of the battle changed. A single F-4F Wildcat, alone against 8 incoming bombers, was not a situation naval doctrine anticipated. Yet this was the Pacific War, unpredictable, unforgiving, and shaped by seconds. O'Hare lowered his nose, throttle forward, propeller pulling the aircraft into a controlled descent. The Wildcat vibrated as it accelerated. Thin wisps of cloud streaked past his canopy. The altimeter needle dipped steadily. Ahead, the Japanese formation grew larger, the lead bomber's silhouette sharpening with each passing heartbeat. The G4M Bettys maintained a steady approach, their flight path unwavering. Their airspeed was disciplined, engines humming in synchronized rhythm. The bomber crews could not yet see the Wildcat closing from above. Their focus was on the horizon, and the target, they believed, lay unprotected. O'Hare checked his distance again. Too far, and his rounds would scatter. Too close, and he risked colliding or taking a burst of defensive fire to the cockpit. He waited until he could see the individual rivets along the bomber's engine cowling. Then he fired. A single, controlled burst. 450 caliber guns roared in unison, their tracers slicing through the air ahead of him. The first rounds struck the lead bomber's starboard engine. Fuel ignited instantly. Flames erupted along the wing route, curling into the slipstream. The bomber shuddered, rolled slightly, and began to descend. But O'Hare had no time to watch it fall. He pulled up sharply, climbing back into partial cover behind a scattered cloud formation. The Japanese gunners reacted quickly. Defensive fire arced upward from the second line of bombers, their machine guns spraying the sky ahead. But their arcs were mistimed. By the time they adjusted, O'Hare was gone, momentarily invisible inside a thin layer of cloud. He emerged again only seconds later. This time he aimed for the bomber at the far left of the formation. Another short burst. More sparks. The left engine tore apart, metal fragments scattering. The bomber dropped out of formation, trailing black smoke. A third Betty shifted position to avoid collision, forcing the entire formation to loosen its structure. The once tight box was unraveling. O'Hare climbed once more, using altitude as both shield and weapon. The clouds around him were now part of his maneuvering pattern, concealing his repositioning, breaking the bomber crew's ability to track his approach, and forcing their gunners into reactive chaos. His Wildcat's engine growled as he banked steeply, turning the aircraft for another pass. Below, the Japanese formation began to register the threat. The leader of the remaining bombers issued commands. Gunners shifted positions, scanning the upper arcs for the lone attacker. But clouds distorted depth perception. Every flash of sunlight off the Wildcat's wings seemed to appear and vanish in an instant. When O'Hare dove the third time, the bomber crews were ready, at least in theory. They opened fire prematurely, their tracers cutting empty sky. The Wildcat burst from the cloud cover at a sharp angle directly into the blind spot between two bombers. He held his fire until the nearest target filled his gun sight. Another burst. More flames, more confusion. He repeated the pattern: climb, disappear, dive, fire, turning altitude into ammunition, turning seconds into opportunity. Every maneuver was technically risky. A misjudged ascent could stall the Wildcat. A mistimed dive could overshoot the formation. But O'Hare's instincts were at their peak. His timing was flawless. The Japanese formation was now compromised. What had begun as an 8-plane assault was reduced to a scattered cluster of burning aircraft, damaged engines, and panicked repositioning. The bomber crews could no longer maintain cohesion. The defensive crossfire that once protected them was falling apart. Their carefully arranged geometry of overlapping guns had dissolved. O'Hare's ammunition was running low. His indicators told him he had only a few bursts left, perhaps 10 seconds of total fire remaining. But there were still bombers heading toward Lexington. He looked down and saw the distant shape of the carrier group turning hard to starboard, preparing to evade torpedoes that might still be released. There was no room for hesitation. He began another climb. The Wildcat shook as he pulled back on the stick. Engine strained at high angle of attack. He pierced the top of the cloud layer once more. Above him, the sky opened into a blinding pale blue. He leveled out, took a breath, and banked his aircraft for the next dive. One pilot. A handful of rounds. A formation on the edge of collapse. And, as he lined up his gun sight for what might be the final burst he could afford, he knew the next seconds would decide the fate of the Lexington and everyone aboard her. O'Hare rolled the Wildcat into his fourth attack run, the sun glinting off his canopy as he dropped back through the thinning layer of cloud. The bomber formation below had stretched into a ragged line, no longer the tight, disciplined box that had once threatened Lexington with coordinated destruction. Smoke trailed from 2 crippled aircraft. A third spun toward the sea in a long, violent arc. But several Betty bombers remained on course, still heading toward torpedo release range. The remaining crews were tense now, alert and scanning. They had abandoned their earlier confidence. Their formation wavered in altitude as each pilot attempted to maintain spacing while evading the lone fighter diving unpredictably from above. Gunners leaned against their glass turrets, hands trembling slightly on their grips. They knew where the American fighter would likely come from, but the clouds made every shadow a possible threat. O'Hare took advantage of that anxiety. He aimed for the bomber flying highest on the right flank, a position critical for maintaining the formation's lateral spacing. As he broke through the cloud layer, the bomber's dorsal gunner spotted the flash of metal. He opened fire immediately, his tracers racing upward. O'Hare tightened his dive, angling slightly to throw off the gunner's aim. The Wildcat's control surfaces strained as airflow increased across the wings. When the bomber filled his gun sight, O'Hare fired a short, devastating burst. The rounds tore into the right engine and cockpit area. Smoke erupted. The bomber veered sharply downward. Inside, the crew struggled to regain control, but the damage was catastrophic. Another Betty peeled away to avoid collision, and the formation's structure fell apart even further. O'Hare pulled up into another climb, But this time, the Wildcat shook more violently. He had pushed the airframe hard. Oil pressure flickered. The engine temperature climbed. He knew he couldn't sustain many more vertical maneuvers, not without risking a stall or engine failure miles from the carrier. Yet he didn't stop. Below him, 3 bombers still pressed forward, their pilots committed to the attack. Even damaged, even shaken, Japanese doctrine demanded mission completion above all else. If one torpedo struck Lexington, the price would be catastrophic. O'Hare re-entered the cloud for one final repositioning turn. Inside the gray mist, visibility dropped to near zero. Moisture streaked across the canopy. He could barely see his own wingtips. But the cloud was his refuge, his shield, his reset point. He trusted his instincts, counting seconds, monitoring his artificial horizon, adjusting trim to maintain a steady climb. Behind the thin wall of vapor, he was invisible. When he emerged, he was directly above the center of the broken formation. Only 3 short bursts of ammunition remained. He lined up on the nearest bomber and dove again. The Japanese crew spotted him early this time. Tracer fire cut upward in tight arcs. O'Hare didn't waver. He pressed the trigger and let out a single, calculated burst. Half a second. No more. The rounds struck the wing root. A fireball erupted instantly. The bomber plunged toward the water, trailing flames across the sky. 2 bombers remained. He climbed once more, engine groaning, Wildcat trembling as if protesting the strain. He cleared the last cloud bank at reduced speed. His ammo counter was nearly empty, maybe 5 seconds of firing time. Below him, the final 2 Bettys broke formation intentionally, a rare maneuver for Japanese crews. They split slightly apart, hoping to complicate his approach. If even one reached torpedo release range, the Lexington could still be lost. O'Hare descended toward the leftmost bomber. The dorsal gunner fired early, tracers passing below the Wildcat's belly. O'Hare slid sideways, adjusting his dive angle. When the bomber filled his reticle, he squeezed the trigger. A short burst answered. Tracers walked across the engine cowling. The Betty lurched, its left engine erupting into a violent plume of flame. It banked hard, descending uncontrollably. O'Hare released the trigger. His guns fell silent. Only 1 bomber remained. The last Betty, its pilot realizing he was alone, made a desperate dash toward the carrier's predicted position. Smoke from burning aircraft drifted below, clouding the horizon. During his final climb, O'Hare checked his ammunition drums, empty. Every round had been fired. He had nothing left, but he wasn't finished. He dove anyway. Not to fire, but to distract, to harass, to force the last bomber off its attack run. The Japanese pilot spotted the Wildcat descending toward him and instinctively jinked right, thinking it was another firing pass. The sudden movement disrupted his torpedo run angle. He lost precious seconds correcting his path, seconds the Lexington used to maneuver out of the optimal attack corridor. The bomber released too early, its torpedo splashing harmlessly into open sea. Moments later, anti-aircraft fire from the carrier's escorts tore the last bomber apart. O'Hare pulled away, his ammunition gone, engine protesting. Fuel low, but the carrier below was safe. He had stopped the attack. Alone. The sky behind him burned with the wreckage of enemy aircraft, and as he turned toward the Lexington, the full weight of what he'd done had not yet reached him. That realization would come only after he landed, when he saw the stunned faces of the deck crews who had watched the impossible unfold above them. When O'Hare approached the Lexington after the battle, the deck crews already knew something extraordinary had happened. They had watched pieces of burning aircraft fall from the sky. they had tracked the single Wildcat moving in and out of cloud cover, diving repeatedly into danger without support. Radar operators reported multiple aircraft dropping off their screens in rapid succession. Yet no one aboard the carrier knew the full scale of what O'Hare had accomplished. Not until his wheels touched the deck and the canopy slid back. He climbed out of the cockpit exhausted, sweat-soaked, eyes strained from the intensity of the engagement. His plane bore scars, bullet tracks across the wings, holes in the fuselage, chipped propeller edges from flying debris. One of the deck officers approached him and asked almost casually how many bombers he had engaged. O'Hare, still catching his breath, answered with the only certainty he had. "I got a few of them." What followed was a methodical process. Damage control teams logged the carrier's maneuver records. Anti-aircraft batteries recorded the bombs they had fired. Fighter direction officers retraced radar tracks. Multiple eyewitnesses described O'Hare's repeated dives through the clouds. Slowly, the picture came together. 6 bombers had been heading toward Lexington from O'Hare's sector. By the end of the engagement, 5 had been destroyed or fatally damaged. The final bomber's torpedo drop had been forced off course by O'Hare's unarmed harassment dive, leaving the carrier untouched. The Japanese strike, coordinated and dangerous, had failed entirely because of one pilot's intervention. Meanwhile, Japanese records and post-war accounts confirmed the devastation. Crews from Rabaul, who survived the fight, reported shock at the sudden collapse of their formation. Many had never seen a single enemy fighter inflict such damage. They described a Wildcat that appeared from clouds with impossible timing, striking with precision, then vanishing as quickly as it arrived. One surviving gunner recalled thinking a whole squadron was attacking, only later realizing it had been one aircraft. The U.S. Navy's official after-action review reinforced the magnitude of the moment. The Lexington's survival had hinged on seconds. Had even 2 Bettys made it to torpedo range, the carrier might have been crippled or sunk. The war in 1942 could not afford the loss of another major ship. America's early carrier fleet was thin, operating on a knife edge. Every vessel mattered. Within hours, O'Hare's story began to circulate through the task force. Pilots spoke his name with admiration. Crewmen passed the story across decks. Commanders recognized that what he had done was not only heroic, it was strategically vital. His defense had preserved the carrier, protected thousands of lives, and allowed the Lexington to continue operating in the Pacific at a time when every American asset was stretched beyond capacity. News reached Rear Admiral Wilson Brown, commander of the task force. Brown summoned O'Hare for a detailed debrief, asking him to walk through every maneuver, every burst of gunfire. When the extent of the engagement was clear, Brown forwarded the report to higher command with an unmistakable recommendation. O'Hare's actions merited the nation's highest military honor. On the Japanese side, the loss was equally significant. Several of the bomber crews were among their most experienced. The defeat disrupted upcoming strike plans and forced commanders at Rabaul to reconsider the vulnerability of their long-range bomber formations. Their assumption that American fighters lacked the precision and aggression necessary to break apart coordinated attacks had been shattered. The psychological effect was immediate. Back aboard the Lexington, the weight of the engagement settled slowly. O'Hare remained quiet, reserved, more thoughtful than celebratory. He reviewed his gun cameras, checked ammunition logs, and replayed the engagement in his mind. Only when he saw the looks of relief on the faces of sailors, men who knew how close they had come to catastrophe, did he begin to understand what he had prevented. The next days would transform this aerial battle from an isolated incident into a defining moment in naval aviation history. The impact of O'Hare's actions traveled far beyond the deck of the Lexington. Within hours, radio transmissions across the Pacific carried fragments of the story, first as rumors, then as confirmed reports. Naval intelligence compiled the data, cross-checking kill assessments with radar logs, eyewitness accounts, and the Wildcat's gun camera footage. When the final tally emerged, the U.S. Navy officially credited Lieutenant Edward "Butch" O'Hare with destroying 5 enemy bombers in a matter of minutes, single-handedly stopping an attack that could have changed the course of the Pacific campaign. The significance of the moment went deeper than numbers. At a time when Japanese aircraft dominated the skies and Allied forces were still reeling from losses across Asia, O'Hare's feat demonstrated that American pilots, not yet seasoned, often outnumbered, flying older aircraft, could fight back with precision and ingenuity. His success challenged the perception of Japanese invincibility and proved that tactical discipline, not numerical advantage, would determine the future of the war in the air. By early March, O'Hare was ordered back to the United States. He had expected a short debriefing, perhaps temporary reassignment. Instead, he stepped into a whirlwind of national attention. Newspapers ran headlines calling him the Navy's first ace and the man who saved the Lexington. Radio stations broadcast summaries of his intercept mission. Civilians wrote letters by the thousands. In a nation desperate for good news, O'Hare became a symbol of resilience, a reminder that the war could be won through courage, skill, and determination. The formal recognition came on April 21, 1942. In a ceremony on the White House lawn, President Franklin D. Roosevelt presented O'Hare with the Medal of Honor, the highest decoration for military valor. The citation detailed his extraordinary heroism and conspicuous gallantry, emphasizing that he had acted alone, without hesitation, against overwhelming numbers. Photographs from the ceremony show O'Hare standing straight-backed, modest, almost uncomfortable with the sudden national spotlight. Behind the decoration, however, lay a deeper transformation. O'Hare's achievement influenced naval aviation doctrine. Fighter commanders studied his engagement carefully, analyzing the value of high-angle attacks, ammunition discipline, and the strategic use of cloud cover. New training programs emphasized solo initiative and decisive action, qualities that would prove essential in later battles across the Pacific. On the Japanese side, the loss forced a reassessment of bomber tactics. Commanders at Rabaul increased fighter escort requirements and adjusted formation spacing to reduce vulnerability to head-on attacks. The psychological blow was equally significant. Surviving crewmen spoke of disbelief that one fighter had dismantled their formation. For pilots trained in rigid tactical doctrine, O'Hare's unpredictable movements through clouds created confusion they were not prepared to counter. As months passed, the story of the lone Wildcat pilot became part of the evolving identity of the U.S. Navy's carrier force. His name was invoked during briefings, his tactics incorporated into training manuals, his example used to instill confidence in pilots who would later fight at Coral Sea, Midway, and Guadalcanal. Yet for O'Hare himself, the aftermath brought no sense of invulnerability. He continued flying combat missions, aware that his survival depended on skill, discipline, and a measure of luck. Fellow pilots described him as humble, soft-spoken, and intensely focused. Never boastful, even when asked to recount the battle that made him a national figure. Tragically, his story did not end with fame. In November 1943, during night operations off the USS Enterprise, O'Hare disappeared while intercepting enemy aircraft near Tarawa. His plane vanished into the darkness. No wreckage was recovered. The Navy listed him as missing in action, and later presumed dead. his legacy endured, both in the tactics he demonstrated and in the spirit he embodied. The Lexington survived 1942, its fate changed by the actions of one man who confronted an enemy formation alone, guided not by certainty, but by discipline and duty. In the vastness of the Pacific, where thousands of miles of open water separated fleets and airfields, war often came down to moments measured in heartbeats. The engagement that unfolded above the Lexington on February 20th, 1942, was one of those moments when the outcome of a single decision shaped far larger events. O'Hare did not have time to weigh strategy or consider recognition. He acted because the alternative was unthinkable. The discipline of years, the instincts of a trained aviator, and the quiet resolve of a man who understood what was at stake converged in those brief, violent minutes. His fight became more than a tactical victory. It revealed the human dimension of air combat, how fear, clarity, training, and responsibility meet in a cockpit thousands of feet above the sea. Technology mattered. Doctrine mattered. But in the end, it was the courage of one pilot that stood between a carrier and its destruction. O'Hare's story reminds us that history is shaped not only by sweeping offensives and grand strategy, but by individuals who choose action when inaction would be easier. For the Japanese crews, the encounter was equally unforgettable. They witnessed the unraveling of their formation not because their aircraft were inferior or their training inadequate, but because an opponent fought with a level of precision they had not expected so early in the war. Their shock reflected a larger truth. Air superiority is never static. It shifts with innovation, instinct, and the willingness to challenge expectations. Even today, O'Hare's legacy endures. Airports, ships, and squadrons bear his name. Pilots study his engagement as a lesson in tactical ingenuity. Historians cite it as a turning point in the psychological balance of the Pacific Air War. And yet, the essence of his achievement remains profoundly simple. One man saw danger, understood the cost of failure, and chose to act with absolute commitment. The skies above the Pacific have long since grown quiet. The carriers, the bombers, the fighters, they are relics now. But the story of the lone wildcat diving again and again through scattered clouds endures, a reminder of what one pilot can accomplish when everything depends on a moment of courage.